afternoon and welcome to today's Lockdown Learning Conversation. This week, Israel and Jewish communities around the world will be commemorating Yom Hashoah. In this afternoon's conversation, we will be joined by a second-generation Holocaust survivor who will discuss how the current COVID-19 pandemic has unexpectedly brought to the surface the trauma of the Holocaust. Before I introduce our speakers today, I want to let you know about next week's Lockdown Learning Conversation. We will be joined by Yair Golan, who was Deputy Chief of Staff of the IDF and is now a member of the Knesset. Yair will be joining us a couple of days before Israel's Memorial and Independence Days, and will be speaking about how he typically marks those days and about how Israel will mark them this year. He will also provide us with his analysis of Israel's current security environment. Simone Szalmuk-Singer is our guest of honor today. Her parents were Holocaust survivors, and she wrote in late March on the Jewish Women of Words website about how the COVID-19 pandemic has triggered within her unexpected trauma. For those of you who don't yet know about it, Jewish Women of Words is an online magazine for Jewish women of all ages to get in touch, connect, and try things out. It is a unique platform that publishes writers from all ages and from around the world, and it was co-founded by our two guests today. Simone is motivated by a strong sense of service to the Jewish community and holds a number of leadership positions. She is co-vice president of Jewish Care Victoria, co-chair of the Australian Jewish Funders, director of the Erdi Foundation, and co-founder of Jewish Women of Words. Simone is passionate about developing Jewish communal leadership and is a mentor in several leadership programs, a senior fellow in the Schusterman Fellowship Program, and a member of the Schusterman Fellowship Senior Fellows Advisory Committee. Simone was formerly president of JNF Victoria and Australian National Vice President. For many years, Simone worked as a lawyer specialising in employment law. Tonight, Simone will be speaking with her friend and collaborator, Liora Miller. Liora is a project manager at Mount Scopus College. She is a co-founder and managing editor of Jewish Women of Words and a board member of Parachute, which provides micro grants to help children impacted by trauma. Liora is the co-founder of the Elul Fellowship, a volunteering program for school leavers. I am really looking forward to this conversation, and so without further ado, I will hand you over to Liora.
Hi everyone. So Simone, this is not normally how we'd interact, but what is more, it is these days, yes. But I guess what's more usual is our work together on Jewish Women of Words. And that was the impetus for this interview in an article you wrote entitled "Borders Slamming Shut, Echoes of My Parents' Conversations." And in it, you describe your rising panic to get your daughter Zoe home from Israel when flights were becoming scarcer and scarcer. Can you describe to us briefly the position that you found yourself in?
Okay, so we need to rewind about a month, 5 weeks, till around the 10th or 11th of March, which to most of us seems like a lifetime ago, when everything was changing really quickly, and Israel at that time was quite ahead of the world in all its border restrictions, all of its lockdown restrictions that it was putting in place. And it was becoming more evident that my daughter, who was on a gap year program in a midrashah, religious seminary in Jerusalem, that program was going to run into some trouble with continuing to actually to go on. And as they started closing schools in Israel, I had already sort of quietly and secretly gone into this complete panic of, you know, this program's going to stop. Where is she going to stay? There wasn't a realistic option for her to stay in Israel, because this wasn't like, let's stay with family for 2 weeks. It was clearly going to be at least a couple of months. I needed to get her home, and I wanted to get her home. I didn't say anything till the Friday of that week, about the I think it was 17th of March or so. And I, basically then it came blurting out of my mouth, "Zoe, I want you to get on a plane in 2 days. I want you home." To which her reaction was, and also my husband's reaction, and really the rest of the family was, "Mum, you're completely overreacting. This is insane." But of course, as things progressed even faster, by the Sunday, so from Friday to the Sunday, it was obvious that the midrashah was going to have to close down, and they were going to switch to online learning for however long, and her program realistically wasn't going to get back up till September. So there began the massive rush of finding her, getting her on a flight, and we still could get her on a flight with points to come home. I mean, she'd only been on a program for two months. And we were sending her through France. And then that night we found out that some other Aussie kids who were coming home from Gap Year program were actually going to be on her flight. So I felt a little bit relieved that she wasn't going to go through this by herself, because remember, at the time it wasn't even a question so much of the borders being shut immediately. It was more, oh my God, we were putting her on a plane to get coronavirus. Like, are we insane? You know, it was just the danger of it all as well. Then we found out a few hours later that all of those Aussies had decided not to go on that flight because they heard it was cancelled because it was going through France. And of course, we couldn't verify this with anyone because no one from the airline or the travel agent or anyone was actually had any knowledge of whether this flight was going to go ahead. We decided to stick with it until the morning Australian time of the day that she was supposed to leave. And then an SMS in the middle of an early morning meeting flashed up on my screen from my cousin in Israel saying, the French president has just determined that the airspace over France is going to close. And of course, Zoe was about to fly to France. And so this was my biggest fear, that she'd be stuck there. So mad rush to get her off that flight and find another flight through London, which we hope, well, if she got stuck there, at least we've got family there. But even that was stressful because Singapore was starting to make noises about the fact they weren't going to let flights in from the UK. So you can be rest assured that once she got on that plane, I was very fixated on that little phone screen, the plane flying across, going from Tel Aviv to London, to Singapore, to Sydney, and then to Melbourne until we finally got her home.
Wow, that would have been a night that you'll remember, I'm sure, watching that dot of a plane travel.
It was 30 hours. I don't think I slept at all.
Yeah. So you talked about that Zoe and Barry, your husband, thought you were being completely irrational on that Friday night when you were talking about getting Zoe home. Why do you think your reaction to the impending crisis was so different to theirs?
So it was really interesting. I actually, for the first time in many years, and probably for the first time that I can remember, Zoe being on the other side of the world and this whole concept of borders shutting and airspace closing just triggered this second generational trauma that I had grown up with, but really had managed to keep under control for the most part of my life. And suddenly I was back in that space where I was experiencing, it was like the early days of, you know, when I was learning about the Holocaust from my mother, who was a survivor of Auschwitz. And there were a lot of stories in our family around people who were getting treatment in another country just as the Holocaust was breaking out, or on a school summer camp, and then we never saw these people again. So there were a lot of stories around separation. So I was being triggered in a way where I thought, oh my God, what is this inside of me that is, you know, reacting like this? And so it was already quite obvious to the family around me that at that stage, there were two groups of people at that stage. When you think back 5-6 weeks ago, those who sort of thought, oh my God, what's going on in the world? And, you know, people like me who were able to catastrophize it right till the end of its run. And then there were those who were, it's fine, especially in Australia, because we were quite a few weeks behind what was happening in Europe and in America. I was saying, no, it's fine, it'll be over in a month or so and we're all going to be good. Because this was before Melbourne and got to stage 3 lockdown. So, you know, everyone, you had those two groups of people, and I was so firmly in the, oh my God, what is happening to me? So it was very much bringing up that second generation trauma for me.
I should say at this time that anyone who's watching, if you want to write some questions, Bren will be moderating and he can send them through to us. So it's not just me conducting the interview. If you want to ask Simone some questions, if she's piqued your interest in any particular respect, please feel free to send them through. So Simone, you talked about being a second generation survivor and how this had triggered all these emotions in you. How do you think being a second generation survivor has shaped your life? And I guess the second part to that question is, does it have an impact on how you're dealing now with the COVID crisis?
It's hugely shaped my life. I mean, everything I do, it's really embedded in me, this huge sense of service to the community. Because my mother had gone through Auschwitz and because my father had been in Siberia and then fought in the War of Independence in Israel, in the Palmach, you know, I've got this unconditional Zionism approach. So even though I might really disagree with lots of things the Israeli government does, I have this unconditional love of Israel and will always find a way to connect and rationalise and engage and so forth. And so therefore, you know, in all the positions that I hold now and that I've held in the past, it all reflects that connection and wanting to build Jewish community and Jewish identity and continuity. Very, very important to me. As for how that's coming through now, so, you know, in that initial phase, I was very panicked, and I mean, I was so sort of out of sorts because of that second generation thing. You know, I felt this need. I wanted to like be able to call my parents and sort of say, we're told to stock up, like, what do I do? You know, I was like paralyzed by it, and I thought they would know, they would have known, and why haven't they taught me and given me the resilience to know this? And the only person I'd actually confessed this to was a childhood friend of mine from Israel who lives in New York, who was sensing the fact that I was completely sort of panicking because I was answering her messages at 3 a.m, 4 a.m. Melbourne time. So she realised there was not a lot of sleeping going on. And so she started talking me through stocking up, like telling me, I said, I don't even know what to go get. I was just not, you know, I was a communal leader with a very clear sense of thinking on one hand and making decisions around organisations with financial implications and all that. That was all clear. But on the other hand, I was like, how do I stock up?
And so, Simone, you're not telling me you're one of those hoarders who...
No, I was not a hoarder, but I didn't get off to a really good start, you know. So she said, you'll feel a lot more in control if you go and you get some meat and you put it in your freezer. So, you know, she checked in on me on, you know, the first day, like a day later, and I said, so I've ordered, you know, 6 months worth of coffee for our coffee machine and some wine. And she writes back straight away and she goes, what about food?
No, but so, she should have known that coffee and wine, well, that was what was really going to get you through.
Well, yeah, well, particularly the coffee, I mean, really. So then there, you know, she checked after that. But now that I've sort of, once I found my way to cope with this, I've really got a sense of the importance of this moment in history. And this is a huge time. This is a time period that we're all going to study, and from all different perspectives. And it's as monumental as a world war. And it's not the Holocaust. What we're going through now is terrible. There are parallels, but we're not, thankfully, living in cities that are being bombed around us with shortages of foods and millions being murdered. I mean, with respect to the Holocaust, we have to respect that it is not that, but it is global in nature. I mean, most of humanity is in some form of isolation or lockdown now. It's something like that we haven't really experienced in our lifetime, for sure. And so I'm quite conscious of, well, how do I want to, what do I want to do in this time? What are the values that I want to embody during this time? And that's really defined the way that I've approached all my different roles in basically helping people and helping them get through.
I mean, before we get to that, when you talk about the values that you want to espouse, I guess as a mum and with daughters and a son, values are really important. How you behave and how your children see you behave in times of crisis, I think, is really important because they take their lead from you.
Absolutely.
So before we get to the leadership role, how's that happening on a personal basis in your family?
Well, I think, you know, they're seeing me spending a lot of time in a lot of meetings that are focused on helping in the community. And when I'm not doing that, I'm actually intentionally, reaching out to people and seeing how they are, my friends and family. Because one thing I've realised in this time was people needed to be heard. I suspected that a lot of people, I wasn't the only neurotic person around at the beginning of this. And, sometimes I'd call a friend randomly just to check in, and I'd find them in the middle of the biggest panic attack. And they just needed to be heard for 10 minutes, and then it was all better. And then from the community perspective, my kids are quite aware of all the different roles that I play. And I'm really privileged to be able to make a difference from all different angles in our community. So with Jewish Women of Words, we've seen the submission of articles go right up because people have actually found it as an incredible place to reflect and to express how they feel, and to hear that they're not alone. So, just to this one article that I'd written, we got an enormous amount of responses, but personally, and messages and telephone calls and everything else saying, thank you for articulating this. And, thank you for making me, you said everything I'm thinking. With AJF, with the Jewish Funders and Launchpad, we've built these communities of members and of Launchpad alumni, and we've seen that they need to connect. They want to connect. So we are giving them all the connection and all the learnings possible, and in fact, making that available to the whole community, especially the Jewish not-for-profits as well, to say, okay, we're here to help now to do that. And that's been incredible. The Erdi Foundation, from the day very early on when it really ramped up, Alyssa Wolf was on the phone to most of our grantees saying, how are you doing? We've got your back. How are you doing? What do you need? And so very early on, we were in the position of being able to say, okay, how can we quickly pivot now to help in this situation? And where can we have the most impact as a foundation? And then you get to Jewish Care, and we're looking after the most vulnerable in our community across all the vulnerabilities. And I suppose I've never been more proud of that, of this organisation, and realised how important it is as I have in this time, because, whilst Melbourne doesn't have a federation and a single organisation, we've actually got an incredible infrastructure to be able to help not only the elderly and people with disabilities, but people in financial distress. And we have the systems in place to not only just hand out money, but look at the whole financial situation in a very robust way with proper rigour and all of that. And so it's been an incredible privilege to see it be empowered and to be scaled up so that it can deal with the rising claims, as well as watching it collaborate unbelievably with all the food distribution groups. So, going back to last year, AJF had actually convened a collab of all the food distribution groups and with Jewish Care, saying, so everyone would know what they're all doing. And then when the crisis came, it was so easy for Jewish Care and all the groups, like our Village Kitchen and Sea Care and so on, to come together and make sure that they're helping each other and working together and making sure that the people who need help are getting it, and getting it now, and getting it quickly. And that incredible collaboration is going on at an unbelievable level. So I'm really privileged to actually have a line of sight into where things are working so incredibly well in our community to help people.
Yeah, so I guess that you'd see that as a real plus, or one of the few positives coming out of a crisis like this, because it could go either way. I mean, it could be very fragmented, or decisions like with the federal government, decisions that would otherwise have taken months or even years to make significant changes to structures are happening overnight or in a couple of days. And I guess the same could be said for organisations that you're seeing in terms of collaborating together, who sort of have sort of same causes or the same endpoint. They're managing to make these decisions far more quickly than they otherwise would. The red tape is being dispensed with, and they're getting things done.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, a lot of it's built on foundations that have been built for a while, in nurturing those relationships. But, you know, it is amazing to see that we're really, for the most part, egos have been put aside, and this is about making sure that we can help as many people who will need it. And, you know, we're only at the beginning of understanding the extent of the crisis for our community.
Mm. So in the article, you talk about your aunt's video, your aunt who lives in Israel, this powerful video that she sent to her cousins and her grandchildren and her nieces and nephews. And you said it really helped you deal with the crisis. So Bren, you've got a copy of that video. Can you play that now for our audience? And then Simone will come back to you to talk about it.
We don't seem to have volume.
No, there's no volume. We've got the subtitles. So unfortunately, we didn't get volume on that. She was speaking in Hebrew, and your daughter, Mia, actually added the subtitles to that. It was really, I mean, you didn't hear her voice. So I guess you're just going to have to try and imagine this 95-year-old woman who'd been through the Holocaust, this incredible voice. But you would have read the subtitles and understood the meaning of what she was saying. How did it impact you when you're going through all of this? You're very close with your family in Israel. How did it impact you just seeing her and hearing those words?
Enormously. I mean, you know, in one word, enormously. And I should say, by the way, the video, we had posted it on the Jewish Women of Words Facebook page, so you can see it there. It's not just what she says, it's in the context of what she says and what she is for me. So my auntie Pesha, I didn't have any grandparents. 3 of them perished in the Holocaust and 1 in the early 50s, so I never knew grandparents. So my auntie Pesha was like, it's my grandmother, and a very, very powerful figure in my whole upbringing. Now, she, during the war, she was hidden in the roof of a barn in the middle of nowhere by a very religious Christian family who were later recognised as righteous Gentiles. So she was in this barn, in this roof for 2 years, and there was no, you know, there was no toilet paper, definitely, but there was no Netflix. There were, you know, food was scarce, etc. And, you know, to keep herself amused, just to give you a flavour of what it was like, she slept on a straw, sort of a mattress of straw that was infested with fleas, and it was just horrible. And so to keep herself not, you know, from boredom, she would play these games. Well, if I catch 50 fleas, then I'll survive this, and if I don't, then I won't survive it. You know, so really, really extreme. And then after the war, you know, her life has been wonderful, but it hasn't been easy. Immigrating, you know, getting to Israel in the way, the story of Exodus, going across Europe and crossing borders illegally, and instead of getting on the Exodus ship, she was on one called the Moledet with my father and her husband, my uncle, ending up interned in Cyprus for around, I think, 18 months, like a very long time. She had her first baby in Cyprus and then came to Israel with a 3-month-old baby. And, you know, there was nothing easy about life in Israel in the late 40s and early 50s. And she's experienced, you know, some terrible family tragedies, the most recent of which 2.5 years ago, her oldest grandson, with whom she had an incredible relationship, very, very close, he took his life. So she's really endured a lot, and yet she sits there with the softest voice saying, you know, this too will end, and, you know, we'll get through this. And I think, you know, if after all of that, she can dig deep for resilience after everything she's been through. Well, you know, I'm sure going to find my resilience somewhere after this privileged life that I've lived. You know, if she can do it, then I just have to do it. I have absolutely no choice. So she was a huge element of a coping mechanism. And the second one was, as a second generation, I spent many years reading a lot of Holocaust literature, but one that really stood out for me in my 30s was Viktor Frankl's, and his whole approach to that, you know, everything can be taken away from you except for your attitude and how you will actually react in circumstances. And again, you know, really realizing we are in a time like this is it. This is a time when we find out how we react, you know, because as a child of Holocaust survivors, you think, how would I have reacted in that situation? How would I have coped? Well, you know, now, again, it's not the Holocaust, but, you know, now in this situation, now's the time to find out how you're going to cope. And you can determine, and you've got the power to do that. So those two elements together, my auntie's resilience and you know, Viktor Frankl's approach, that's what's shaping my ability to, and everything I'm doing at the moment.
Yeah, it reminds me, and I think you've referred to this as well in your article about Edith Eger's book, The Choice.
Yeah.
And she became a clinical psychologist afterwards, and she was also a child survivor of Auschwitz. And reading that book, one message that came out from her is that the question she asks is not, why is this happening to me? Not why me, but what now? It's a really extraordinary mantra to live by. And look, I think we all recognise that we have lives of privilege, and we're able to find the wherewithal to ask the what now rather than be buried by the what me. But it's truly remarkable when you see people like your aunt, who's been through so much, not just be subsumed and overcome by it. It's pretty extraordinary.
She's an extraordinary woman.
Yes, no, absolutely. Now, I've known you for too many years to count, and I may or may not have experienced you being irritated or exasperated or just plain angry over the years of all, you know, through all the experiences we've had. But with your numerous community leadership roles, you always give the impression of being very calm and very measured, calm under pressure. By contrast, if we go back to this very personal crisis with Zoe, it provoked emotions in you of panic and dread and anxiety. And by publishing this article, and certainly by talking about it here, you've made a choice to reveal very publicly your vulnerability and that sense of helplessness that you felt. So I want to ask you, why did you choose to go public?
Really interesting question, which is actually, it's evolved even since I've gone public. But initially, my first thought was, over the years, I've always found, you know, writing, if something's sitting inside you, actually just blurting it out onto paper, that in itself has a therapeutic effect. So, you know, I sort of just started writing because I felt like I just needed to get all of this out, especially once Zoe was home safe and I could breathe. I just needed to get it out of me. And then I thought, you know, that there might be benefit in sharing it, you know, because as I was growing up, because I was such a young second gen person, I didn't know that there were other people out there that were feeling the way I was. I didn't know being second gen was a thing. You know, I had no idea until I started reading books in my 20s. So I suspected that there were probably other people out there who this was maybe bringing in Holocaust issues, or even just suffering and just wanted to know that someone else possibly was. But I'd written the first half of the article and let it, you know, it was just the way I felt. And then I thought, no, this isn't good enough. If I'm actually going to put it out there, I've got to be able to articulate the framework that's helping me actually think sanely now and do what I'm doing. And that's when I, you know, after a few days of thinking about it, really was able to identify what was going on with me. And, you know, I'd written it and I thought, well, does it really need to go there? And I've done a lot of leadership training in the last few years, and you know, there's a lot of talk about vulnerability in leadership, you know, by Brené Brown and Simon Sinek and Tara Moore, all the gurus of leadership all talk about the importance of vulnerability. And you know, I was always saying, yeah, it's really important to be vulnerable, but this was actually putting that into action. It was actually, you know, saying, okay, here goes, and we'll just see what happens. And
but were you aware at the time when you when we published the article that that's what you were doing, or was it something that you kind of reflected upon afterwards? I guess what I'm asking you, was it a conscious choice at the time to put yourself out there, or only by the reactions that you received did you realise what the impact was?
It was conscious without appreciating the power of doing so.
Wow.
So, you know, because I was so aware of this concept of vulnerability in leadership and so forth, but once I did it, the reactions that I was getting and the people who were, you know, people I didn't know or who normally, you know, not have any connection with, were reaching out again in such vulnerable ways. And some of the conversations and email exchanges or messenger exchanges, you know, were going much deeper and even more open into it. I realised how much it was helping people. And, you know, I think it was probably one of the most important acts of leadership that I think I've done ever, almost, because you know, this is a crisis that everybody is grappling with. And, you know, as you said, you know, I can be perceived as, you know, for the most part being, you know, quite rational and being, you know, a good leader and so forth. And so someone in my position, people can think, you know, everything's fine, she's probably all good with this, when they see that, no, she's actually not, that there has been this whole process that she's gone through. Just sharing that vulnerability is helping other people be able to frame what they're thinking and how they are. And I think in this time, vulnerable leadership, acknowledging the uncertainty of everything, is probably one of the most important aspects of leadership in this time. You know, when I think every board meeting I go to, or every meeting, whether it's with your employees or whether it's with board members or so forth, everybody is coming to the table at the moment, to the Zoom table at the moment, with what I'd call, you know, their pandemic backpack on their back. And you don't know what's in that. You know, for some, their business has just dropped 80% overnight. For others, they can't go and see their elderly mother and father because they're in a facility in lockdown, or they just simply can't go inside to see them. For others, they have ill relatives overseas who are very, very ill. And others, you know, have challenges with kids out of school and so forth. Everyone's coming to the table with so much. And you can't ignore that. You can't go, okay, thank you, welcome to the meeting, let's just proceed. It's really important to hold space for everybody there to check in and you know, even uncover their own vulnerability in what they're going through. And I found it in every aspect where that's happening, it's brought people together, and people want to be brought together now more than ever. And, you know, and then from there, we're able to do the work that we're supposed to do, but that's a very important part of it.
So do you think people are willing to open themselves up and be more open about their uncertainties and anxieties at the Zoom board table?
I think so, but you know, it's the person leading the meetings, and you know, people in leadership positions who have to set that tone for them as well. And it's the same with your team at work and wherever it is. You know, it's up for someone has to be able to set that tone and say it's fine. You know, that to talk about this. And, you know, connected to that is also the uncertainty. I mean, we're living in a time of radical uncertainty, and, you often think good leadership is decisive action and so forth. But we don't know what's going to be from one week to the next now. So I'm not saying we throw our hands up in the air and just sort of let our organisations all float through not knowing what's going to happen. We have to obviously plan for different scenarios. But it's okay as a leader, as a person, as a parent to say, I don't know. I don't know. It's this time where you need the transparency and the honesty to be able to say that. And it's the same also between donors and organisations. Organisations are going to be saying, we don't know. And that's okay. We have to be able to have those honest conversations at times like this.
But would you transport that once we're through this crisis, and we will be through it, we don't know when, but at some point in the future we will be, would you still maintain the view that showing your vulnerability as a leader is something important to be doing on an ongoing basis?
Absolutely. I mean, now that I've seen it really in action, as opposed to just, hearing Brene Brown or reading her or Tara Moore or whatever, it doesn't weaken you as a leader at all. It's exactly the opposite. And
so that's a really important statement, what you just stated, that it's not a weakness, because I think certainly the old school would or even now, I think there would be many who would argue that showing that you're uncertain, that you're vulnerable, that you're not sure about things is not the kind of leadership that steers the ship.
And it's interesting because we need resilience in a time like this. This is when our resilience is tested. And as leaders, we need to be resilient. But resilience doesn't get confused with everything's fine all the time, or we're not experiencing these fears. Resilience is the ability to say, this is what's going on for me, and these are the things that I'm considering. It's really, and I've learned how to cope with them and function. I mean, had I stayed in that sort of panic state that I was in those initial few days, stocking up on coffee instead of food, it wouldn't have been ideal. But, I worked through it and realised, okay, this thing inside me, it's come up for the first time in, a long time, and I've just got to learn to live with it. It's okay. I've named it, I've framed it, I'm going to live with it, and it's just going to happen. So I think it's not necessarily being indecisive. Vulnerability isn't about being indecisive. And I think that generally when I think about the workplaces, AJF and Launchpad is a great example of this. It's a very creative and innovative environment. And that's because it's an environment where there isn't a sort of old school leadership. It's a much more open type of leadership where people are not scared to express their ideas and how we do this and how we do that. And so it's incredible. So you get great programming coming out of there. So, that to me shows that that's actually a great way to look at it. And even now, that we're looking after the Jewish services and so forth in the community, but there's a whole other part of the community that's also going to be looked at, the educational framework of, with the Jewish schools and so forth. We've already seen one school come out with an emergency appeal, and, we're going to have lots of issues there. And this will be hopefully the time for open and honest collaboration between the stakeholders, looking at how can we keep our Jewish education system in its broadest sense going, because we know that it's really, really important. So, yeah.
Wouldn't it be amazing if this became the platform for those conversations to actually start to happen? I mean, you and I both know, having been on committees where we've tried to get the conversation going about it, the reluctance of some players, or even if the players are eager, the problem just seems to be insurmountable. So wouldn't it be an extraordinary thing to come out of this crisis if players got together, put egos aside, and just put their heads down to come up with a viable options as to how we see our way forward, because we're forced to. I mean, I think there'll be some organisations and some schools who will be, in dire trouble and they'll be forced to make some difficult decisions.
Yeah. And look, I that's a whole other conversation in itself, whole other session in itself. So, I'm confident that at least we can start the conversation now. So.
I mean, Brene Brown, who you referred to, talks about vulnerability, which I think a lot of people would automatically think of, like you said, as a weakness and as a negative attribute. She talks about vulnerability as growing, that you cannot grow without making yourself vulnerable. And I think, from listening to her, she's actually got this great podcast that I started listening to called Unlocking. So if you haven't listened to it, go ahead, because she's fabulous. And she, having had, decades of research and having been a speaker on the TED stage as well, just is right out there upfront and honest about feeling vulnerable about things that she's doing for the first time.
Yeah, and I think all of those great leaders of leadership at the moment, it's interesting what they're saying in the moment. And one thing that Simon Sinek has just recently said in an interview is, now is the time to double down on empathy. And I think that's really important, and this is part of it. So whether you do it as a leader on a board or a leader at your work or just in your family or with your friends, it's the time where we need to see that increased empathy between people.
Yeah. So we've got a question from Emily Jian from the Zionist Federation. She asks, did your identity as a second-generation Holocaust survivor influence your decision to be a leader within the community?
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. I grew up in a house where by the time I was born, because I came quite late, as I say in the article, I was an accident, they were in a position to help as much as they could. And we had a house full of fundraising events all the time, and they were always looking to be philanthropic in every different aspect that they could. So very much, and I knew that they were like that even before they had what to give. They're the generation who would take from themselves and eat less that week in order to give to a cause. And that's what I really grew up with, and that was what they taught me. It was a very, very, very strong sense of service.
So we've got a question from Pam Buchanan, and this is a really interesting one. Do you think that there's a difference in being able to show vulnerability as women in leadership roles as compared to men? And should there be a difference? I guess I'm going to add that on.
Look, I think there is a difference. Unfortunately, at the moment, there's probably still is a difference. Should there be a difference? Probably not.
Have you seen men being vulnerable or showing that vulnerability, owning up to it?
Yeah, and it's so powerful when they do. And it might not be in as public a way as I did it writing an article like this. It could be in the context of robust board deliberations and things like that, where I have seen it. And it is so powerful, when people when they lay it on the table and say, okay, this is what's bothering me now. Having the uncomfortable conversations, it brings on much better decision making as well.
When you, I guess, concede that you don't have all the answers, that you are looking around your table saying, let's mull on this together, because I think we need a collaborative approach on this. Yes,
I think not having all the answers, the uncertainty is much more part of today's world, in the current crisis. Whereas the vulnerability can exist without the uncertainty as well. When somebody says, this is really important to me because, and that they're saying they're opening up something personal, being a little bit more transparent about the motivations of their argument in a particular situation, you get a much clearer line of sight into, okay, now I get what you're trying to say, and that's part of the argument. So, you know, the uncertainty is stronger now, but it wasn't the case. I mean, 6 months ago, I don't think we were living, you couldn't predict the future, but you weren't living in a time when you can't predict tomorrow.
No, of course, of course. So Yom HaShoah is coming up. We're certainly not going to be commemorating it the way that, as a community, as the way that we are used to doing. I know that I've seen all over emails and Facebook and different links that different organisations are offering the opportunity to commemorate it in different ways. I think AJF, an organisation that you're the co-president with, have suggested or are offering people a way to commemorate. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the things you've seen or you're across in terms of how people will come together at this time?
Well, I can tell you mainly about the one that's happening tomorrow night through AJF launch, and it's under Launchpad's name from 6 to 6:45. What I love about it is it's going to feature a survivor and survivor, second gen, third gen, and possibly beyond, but looking at how they've turned memory into action. You know, so with me, I've turned my memory into being a communal leader, but we're also going to hear from amazing people tomorrow night to hear, you know, how they are taking that memory of the Holocaust and actually turning it into something very special now and meaningful for generations to come. Because our challenge is, how will we keep this memory going when we unfortunately lose the survivors? So I'm sure that'll be a very moving event tomorrow night on Zoom.
And I guess now's the opportunity, I guess, to be really creative and to think beyond the standard very large communal events that have happened in the past that from what I've seen, often frequented by older generations rather than the younger generations, who I think you really do want to keep engaged. And it's very important that they keep that memory and the importance of understanding of what happened. And they don't seem to be attending these larger events. Perhaps it might be the way we move forward to have these smaller events or different types of events to commemorate it. Do you think that things will change even when we go back to our usual times?
You know, we saw that change already last year. Last year was as a result of one of the launch pads where we saw that third generation memory around the Holocaust was really, really important. There was a whole evening presented with Zikaron Besalon where different generations were there going into different rooms talking. It's based on a model in Israel, and it was sold out. And then there was another incredible event, I think with Gen to Gen, with challah baking and so forth, also sold out. And these were on at the end of the day of Yom HaShoah. And the communal event the night before was also sold out. So the most important lesson from all of that is a couple of lessons. Is one, the third and fourth generation, who some in the community think are not interested, they are so interested. They want to preserve the memory. They are searching for ways to do it in a meaningful way. But they may not all want to go to the big communal event. So it's really heartening as a second gen who grew up with all of this to see that, it's not going to die down at all, our memory of the Holocaust, because the younger generations really do think it's important, and especially with, the growth of anti-Semitism. But the other big learning of it, and I think this applies across the board to the Jewish community here and around the world, is that we need different touch points. It's not one size fits all when it comes to Jewish engagement, Israel engagement, anything like that. People need different options to do things, and that's fine.
Yeah, and the one's not better than the other, isn't it?
They're not competing. The more the merrier. I mean, what we saw last year was more people commemorated Yom HaShoah than when there was a single event.
Yeah.
And no one event's better than the others. The people who went to the communal event probably would have hated Zikaron B'Tselem. So, you know, it's fine.
It's a different way of thinking just generally across the board, isn't it? It's not just for commemoration events, it's for Yom Ha'atzmaut as well. And I know, you know, we used to have a similar kind of event to the very large communal thousands of people, to breaking it down into smaller events. And then I think the Zionism Victoria then started having the event of, you know, later in the afternoon and bringing in children from schools from non-Jewish schools or public schools who don't have the opportunity during the day to commemorate it or to celebrate. So it's thinking about it very broadly and looking at, like you said, the touch points, and realizing that different ages, different people from different countries, the Israelis want to commemorate and celebrate in a different way to the Australians, and understanding that, yeah, you can do it a number of different ways.
Exactly. And I mean, that goes for engagement with Israel and Zionism and all of that sort of thing. You know, that's evolved over the years. Just because you don't agree with the Israeli government doesn't mean that you don't love Israel. You know, there's a lot of discussion around that as well. The way we give to Israel or give with Israel, so forth. You know, I mean, again, that's a whole other, we could discuss that for a whole other hour as well.
Yeah. No, there are lots of different topics we could talk about. So by writing, we try to make sense of the world around us and what's happening to us. And Simone and I are founders and editors of Jewish Women of Words. And we encourage all of you who are watching now and who watch it down the track and who are grappling with this period of uncertainty, of isolation, of anxiety, to take some time to think through your emotions. And if you can, to write them down, play with your thoughts and make sense of them. And if you have the inclination, to send them to us at Jewish Women of Words. As Simone referred to previously, we've been inundated, luckily because, you know, people reached out to us as a platform with a wealth of articles about people's reaction to this crisis, how they're dealing with it, how their families are dealing with it. And just like Simone's article did, it enables people to realise that they're not alone. And that's so terribly important, that when you're feeling low and you're feeling anxious, that you know that there are lots of other people who are feeling exactly the same way as you are.
Yeah, and that was one of the reasons we set it up. And we should say that there's a third person in the trio who set up Jewish Women of Words, and that's Deborah Refter. So yeah, it's a completely volunteer-run organisation, and it's really to just give women a platform for their voices and to amplify them.
Yeah, and also if men are thinking, no, it's not just for women, although we did want to offer it a platform for women because they aren't often given a lot of opportunity to do it or to put their views forward, but men are welcome too. We've had articles submitted by men, so if you're a man out there wanting to submit something, then please go ahead and do so. I don't think we've had any more questions come forward. So I just want to thank you, Simone, for your honesty. It's not been an easy thing, I think, for you to come out and be this honest and frank about what you went through. You gave us a window into leading vulnerably by example. It's easy to say it, but it's not easy to practice it. As you said before, you know, you can listen to the podcast and you can listen to the TED Talks and you can say that this is something that's important, but when you actually have to live it, I think it's an entirely different thing. And I want to say thank you to the Zionist Federation of Australia also for providing the platform for this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simone and Liora. I'm so sorry that no one heard the audio on that video of Simone's art. It was a fault at my end. As soon as this conversation finishes, I will paste the link to the video in the comments of this conversation. And I really think that video is worth a watch with the sound on. I'll also put a link to tomorrow night's Launchpad event in the comments section as well. If you enjoyed tonight's conversation, please hit the share button. Your friends and contacts will be able to see this conversation on your own Facebook feed. Otherwise, visit the Jewish Women of Words website. Liora and Simone will be putting this video there. And of course, you'll find some really excellent articles. Please join us next week for, please join us at next week's Lockdown Learning. We'll be back at our usual time of 8 p.m. And as I said earlier, we'll be joined by former Deputy Chief of Staff of the IDF and current Democratic Union MK Yair Golan. Until then, have a safe and healthy week, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.